on the brink of two empires. Today, when you look at a map of the Mediterranean, you see a familiar space. Vast blue seas connecting three continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa. But imagine, more than 2,000 years ago, it wasn't just a sea. It was a colossal battlefield, where two great civilizations harbored the same ambition for domination, Rome and Carthage. Every day, Carthaginian ships flooded the harbors, carrying salt, silver, ivory, and slaves, all enriching a city once called the Queen of the Sea. Meanwhile, Rome, a young republic, not yet an empire but gradually expanding through steel and discipline, had united the Italian peninsula into a single entity. Then one day, trade routes collided with paths of conquest. The Carthaginians wanted to maintain their control of the sea, while the Romans yearned to break their chains and become masters of the Mediterranean. From that point, these two peoples were drawn into a series of wars lasting nearly a century. Wars that would decide who would master the ancient world. And it was in the violent wave of this hatred that a 9-year-old boy placed his hand on a sacrificial altar and swore he would never be a friend to Rome. That boy's name was Hannibal Barca. That oath, seemingly just a whisper within a family, erupted into a flame that engulfed the entire Italian peninsula in fire and smoke. Before we follow Hannibal's journey, from the snow-capped peaks of the Alps to the bloody fields of Cannae, let's return to the beginning. Rome and Carthage, two rising empires, two tigers sharing a cage named the Mediterranean. Part 1. Carthage and Rome. Two rising empires. Let us begin our story not with battles, but with two cities, two worlds, gradually moving toward a fateful confrontation. Carthage, Queen of the Sea Carthage, situated on the coast of North Africa in modern-day Tunisia, was a dazzling city of antiquity. The Phoenicians from Tyre, a city-state in the Near East, founded Carthage in the 9th century BC. And in just a few hundred years, it transformed into a mighty commercial empire, stretching from North Africa, Sicily, and Sardinia to the Iberian Peninsula. The Carthaginians were not renowned land warriors like the Romans. They were merchants, seafarers. From archaeological evidence, we know they carved their names on the sea routes of the Mediterranean, trading everything from tin in Cornwall and silver in Spain to ivory and gold from Africa. Ancient Carthaginian coins even bore the image of the goddess Tanit, a symbol of protection and prosperity. But trade did not mean weakness. Carthage possessed the most powerful fleet in the Mediterranean for centuries. Roman historians described that when the Carthaginian fleet set sail, it was as if the sky itself darkened. It was this naval power that allowed them to control strategic islands, Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, jewels set in the heart of the Mediterranean. Rome, child of the land. In contrast to Carthage, Rome began as a small city on the banks of the Tiber River in central Italy. In the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, Rome gradually unified the Italian peninsula, not with gold or fleets, but with a special weapon: political organization and military discipline. The Romans built a unique system of alliances. After conquering a city-state or tribe, they didn't slaughter everyone, but allowed the vanquished to become semi-independent allies, providing troops for Rome. This enabled Rome to mobilize hundreds of thousands of soldiers, a rare feat in the ancient world. Notably, the Roman army was distinguished by its legions, legiones, highly disciplined and flexible formations that could change structure during battle. Livy, the Roman historian, once wrote, "When a Roman legion marches, The ground itself seems to tremble. If Carthage was the queen of the sea, then Rome was the lord of the land. Two worlds collide. It's not hard to imagine what would happen when a maritime empire and a land empire both cast their eyes upon the Mediterranean. Sicily, the island lying between Italy and North Africa, became the golden apple that both coveted. The First Punic War, 264 to 241 BC, erupted from a conflict in the city of Messina. Rome, which had never possessed a significant fleet, was forced to learn how to build warships. Records tell of the Romans finding a wrecked Carthaginian ship and copying its design to build hundreds of their own. It was a testament to their resilient spirit. From farmers, Romans turned into reluctant sailors and eventually defeated Carthage at sea. At the war's end, Carthage lost Sicily, the fertile land that had fed the entire city. But the pain didn't stop there. While Carthage was in turmoil from a mercenary revolt, Rome seized the opportunity to snatch Sardinia and Corsica, even though the original treaty made no provision for it. For the Carthaginians, this was not just a loss, but an unforgivable humiliation. Hannibal Barca, father of the oath. In this atmosphere of humiliation, one man rose up. Hannibal Barca, the general who had once commanded Carthaginian forces against Rome. He understood that to restore Carthage, he needed to find new land to rebuild its strength, and he chose Iberia, modern-day Spain, a land rich in silver, copper, and fierce native warriors. Before leaving Carthage for Iberia, Hamilcar did something extraordinary. According to Livy, he called his son Hannibal, then just 9 years old, to an altar. There, Hamilcar made the boy place his hand on the sacrificial animal and swear, "I will never be a friend of Rome." Imagine this. In the oppressive setting of a wounded city, a young boy shouldered a feud that spanned generations. From that moment, Hannibal was no longer just a child, but the inheritor of an oath that would ignite a new war, far more brutal than the last. Two worlds collide. It's not hard to imagine what would happen when a maritime empire and a land empire both cast their eyes upon the Mediterranean. Sicily, the island lying between Italy and North Africa, became the golden apple that both coveted. The First Punic War, 264 to 241 BC, erupted from a conflict in the city of Messina. Rome, which had never possessed a significant fleet, was forced to learn how to build warships. Records tell of the Romans finding a wrecked Carthaginian ship and copying its design to build hundreds of their own. It was a testament to their resilient spirit. From farmers, Romans turned into reluctant sailors and eventually defeated Carthage at sea. At the war's end, Carthage lost Sicily, the fertile land that had fed the entire city. But the pain didn't stop there. While Carthage was in turmoil from a mercenary revolt, Rome seized the opportunity to snatch Sardinia and Corsica, even though the original treaty made no provision for it. For the Carthaginians, this was not just a loss, but an unforgivable humiliation. Hannibal Barca, father of the oath. In this atmosphere of humiliation, one man rose up. Hannibal Barca, the general who had once commanded Carthaginian forces against Rome. He understood that to restore Carthage, he needed to find new land to rebuild its strength, and he chose Iberia, modern-day Spain, a land rich in silver, copper, and fierce native warriors. Before leaving Carthage for Iberia, Hamilcar did something extraordinary. According to Livy, he called his son Hannibal, then just 9 years old, to an altar. There, Hamilcar made the boy place his hand on the sacrificial animal and swear, "I will never be a friend of Rome." Imagine this. In the oppressive setting of a wounded city, a young boy shouldered a feud that spanned generations. From that moment, Hannibal was no longer just a child, but the inheritor of an oath that would ignite a new war, far more brutal than the last. Two fateful paths. By the end of the 3rd century BC, both Rome and Carthage stood at a crossroads. Rome had become the master of the Italian peninsula, building its strength on population and military might. Carthage, despite its territorial losses, remained wealthy from trade and was being reborn in Iberia under the Barca family. Two tigers, sharing the same cage, were just waiting for the day to pounce. And it was Hannibal's oath that turned this collision into a fight for survival, not just for revenge, but to decide the future of the entire Mediterranean. This is the foundation of our story. Because to understand why Hannibal chose a path as insane as crossing the Alps, or why Rome could endure horrific defeats without collapsing, we must understand that it all began with an irreconcilable conflict between two worlds, trade and military, sea and land, Carthage and Rome. Part 2. The Flame of Vengeance. Hannibal rises. After Hamilcar, Barca planted the seed of an eternal oath in his son's heart. The wheels of history began to turn. Carthage, once the loser of the First Punic War, now found a new weapon. Not gold, not a fleet, but a man. Hannibal. A youth, forged in the fires of war. From a young age, Hannibal accompanied his father to Iberia. It was a harsh land, filled with warrior tribes like the Celtiberians and Lusitanians, where warfare was almost a way of life. Here, Hannibal learned to understand the local psychology, honing his skills in small but fierce skirmishes. Ancient historians like Polybius recount that Hannibal was not a child raised in luxury. He shared hardships with his soldiers, sleeping on the ground, eating the same rations, enduring cold, rain, and long marches. It was this intimate leadership style that made his soldiers willing to follow him into any danger. When Hamilcar died in a battle in Iberia, his legacy was passed to his son-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair. Hasdrubal strengthened diplomatic ties with the Iberian tribes and even signed a treaty with Rome, pledging not to cross the Ebro River. But fate was about to hand the sword to Hamilcar's son. In 221 BC, when Hasdrubal was assassinated, the Carthaginian army in Iberia unanimously acclaimed a new commander, Hannibal, 25 years old, a young man, but one who already carried in his heart an ancient flame of hatred. A leader beloved by his soldiers. Imagine a 25-year-old man standing before tens of thousands of battle-hardened soldiers. He was not only accepted by them, but immediately revered. That speaks volumes about Hannibal's innate talent. Polybius wrote, "Hannibal had a strange charisma. He was the first to enter battle and the last to withdraw. From historical accounts, we know he often scouted ahead on horseback himself, unafraid of danger. This was not just a general. He was the living embodiment of his father's oath, and the soldiers felt it clearly. The pretext, Saguntum, the spark of war. Rome and Carthage had signed a treaty. Carthage was not to cross the Ebro River in northern Iberia, but south of that river lay a city named Saguntum, an ally under Rome's protection. Hannibal saw Saguntum as a thorn in his side. By besieging Saguntum in 219 BC, he not only tested Rome, but deliberately pushed both nations to the brink of war. Roman historians describe a siege lasting 8 months, fierce and brutal. The people of Saguntum fought to the last, but were ultimately conquered. Rome was furious, sending envoys to demand Carthage hand over Hannibal, and when Carthage refused, the Second Punic War erupted. Here, we must pause to see more clearly. This war was not just a political dispute. It carried a personal motive, a father-to-son oath. Hannibal was not dragged into war, he orchestrated it. Hannibal, from son to symbol. With the siege of Saguntum, Hannibal stepped out of his father's shadow and became the central figure of history. Remember, Carthage had been very cautious after its defeat by Rome. But now, with Hannibal, Carthage was resurgent. Iberia became a rear base rich in silver and mercenaries. Carthage once again had a general who possessed intellect, courage, and an unshakable hatred. Polybius and Livy both agree. From the moment Saguntum fell, there was no turning back for Rome and Carthage. This war would decide who would be the master of the Mediterranean. The flame of an inherited hatred. When we look back, we see something interesting. This war was not inevitable. Rome and Carthage could very well have coexisted, dividing their spheres of influence. But history is not driven by reason alone. It is also driven by emotion, by hatred, by oaths. An oath sworn by a father, a 9-year-old boy's hand on a sacrificial altar. More than a decade later, that boy turned the oath into reality, challenging the most powerful empire of the ancient world. And from here, the fire Hannibal ignited would not just burn in Iberia, but would spread across the Mediterranean, leading to battles that would shake the Roman Republic to its very foundations. Thus, we have witnessed the moment of Hannibal's rise, from a child bearing an oath to a young general, daring to ignite a war with Rome. But what lies ahead is even more terrifying. Because Hannibal would choose a path that the entire ancient world deemed impossible, crossing the Alps to bring the war to Rome's doorstep. Part 3. The unthinkable journey. Crossing the Alps. If you were to ask anyone in the ancient world, is it possible to lead a massive army across the Alps into Italy? The answer would surely be impossible. Those snow-covered, treacherous and cruel mountains had long been considered the natural wall protecting the Italian peninsula. But it was this supposedly impassable barrier that became the stage for one of the most magnificent military journeys in history, Hannibal's crossing of the Alps. Departure from Iberia. In 218 BC, after taking Saguntum, Hannibal decided to execute his most audacious plan, to bring the war directly to Rome's doorstep. He knew full well that Carthage could not compete with Rome at sea, where the Roman fleet was growing ever stronger. So he chose the land route, a gamble no one had ever dared to take. The army that set out from Iberia consisted of about 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants, symbols of power and terror. Polybius, a Greek historian living in the 2nd century BC, described this force as a gathering storm ready to sweep across the continent. From Hispania, Hannibal led his army across the Pyrenees, advancing through what is now southern France. He had to fight local tribes while maintaining order in a vast, multi-ethnic army comprising Libyans, Numidians, Iberians, Celts, and even mercenaries. This demonstrated his exceptional leadership, the ability to unite different peoples with a common goal. Confronting the Gauls and the Rhone River. The next obstacle was the mighty Rhone River. Here, Gallic tribes blocked Hannibal's path, but with clever tactics, Hannibal sent a small force to circle around, cross the river at another point, and launch a surprise attack from the rear. The Gauls panicked and fled, clearing the way for the army to cross. It was at the Rhone that Hannibal first had his war elephants ford water. The historian Polybius recounted the scene of dozens of giant elephants, with riders on their backs slowly making their way across the river, striking terror into the native tribes who had never seen such creatures. This was an image both real and symbolic. Hannibal brought not only soldiers, but also the wonder of the ancient world. The gateway of snow, the first days in the Alps. After the Rhone, a colossal wall appeared before Hannibal, the Alps. The small trade routes through the mountains were meant for scattered merchants, but now had to bear the weight of an entire army. The historian Livy recorded the details. Hannibal faced blizzards, rock slides, and hostile tribes ambushing from above. Often, the Carthaginian troops had to fight while climbing sheer cliffs. In some places, the path was so narrow that elephants and horses fell into deep chasms. In those days, starvation became the greatest enemy. Soldiers had to eat dead horses, even scrape ice for water. But it was in this desperate situation that Hannibal kept the army from disintegrating. He led from the front, encouraging the troops, proving that their commander shared their hardships. Polybius tells an impressive detail. When faced with a frozen cliff, the Carthaginian army couldn't get the elephants across. Hannibal ordered large fires to be lit to crack the rock, then poured sour wine on it to break up the limestone, clearing a path for the army to continue. Perhaps this story was embellished, but it shows the image of Hannibal as a man who dared to challenge nature itself. The price of audacity. The price for this journey was horrendous. When Hannibal descended into the Cisalpine Gaul plain, northern Italy, his army was reduced to about 50,000 soldiers and only a few surviving elephants. He had lost nearly half his force. But the crucial thing was, he had done what all of Rome thought impossible. A foreign army, led by Hannibal, now stood on the threshold of Italy. All of Rome's strategic lines of defense had been bypassed. The psychological effect. Rome in panic. Imagine how the Romans felt. They had expected the war to be fought in Iberia or North Africa, distant and controllable. Instead, Hannibal was present right in the heart of Italy. This was a massive psychological shock. Fear spread across the peninsula. Some Gallic tribes immediately rebelled against Rome and joined Hannibal. Early victories at Ticinus and Trebia further solidified his reputation. Rome, accustomed to waging war abroad, now faced an enemy at its very gates. A journey, remembered in history. The crossing of the Alps was not just a logistical feat, it was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Hannibal had shown the world that no boundary was inviolable. Polybius called it one of the greatest feats of ancient warfare. Napoleon, over 1,500 years later, upon crossing the Alps himself, had to admit, "My journey is but a pale shadow compared to Hannibal's." Remember, Hannibal didn't just bring an army over the mountains, he brought a message. Rome would no longer be safe. That rising empire now knew that the enemy could knock on its door at any time. And that was the first step on Italian soil, a step that changed the course of history. But what awaited Rome was even more terrifying. Ambushes and victories that would stain rivers red with Roman blood. Let's move on to the next chapter. Blood and Fog. Trasimene and the Crisis of Rome. Part 4. Blood and Fog. Trasimene. There are battles in history that are remembered not just for the number of casualties, but for the haunting impression they leave on the human psyche. The Battle of Lake Trasimene in 217 BC was one of them. It was not just a military defeat for Rome, but a moment that shook its beliefs, forcing a mighty republic to look at itself. Flaminius, man of the people. To understand this battle, we need to start with the Roman leader at the time, Gaius Flaminius. He was not a conservative aristocrat from a noble family, but a plebeian politician, a man of the people. Flaminius was known for opposing the Senate and dismissing traditional religious rituals, something many Romans saw as arrogant, even blasphemous. But it was his recklessness and desire to make his mark that made him consul. He wanted to prove he could defeat Hannibal, not with caution, but with a direct, decisive blow. The Roman historian Livy described Flaminius as hot-tempered, unwilling to listen to advice, always pushing his army to march faster, further. And that was exactly what Hannibal was waiting for. The trap at Lake Trasimene. After crossing the Alps and winning at Trebia, Hannibal knew that Rome was desperate for a decisive battle to wash away the shame. So, he deliberately marched through Etruria, central Italy, plundering villages and burning fields, a provocative act designed to force Flaminius to give chase. Before him lay Lake Trasimene, a large lake in Umbria, with a narrow road running along its northern shore, caught between the mountains and the water. It was the ideal terrain for an ambush. Hannibal positioned his soldiers hidden on the slopes surrounding the valley, while a small force acted as bait, luring the Roman army into the trap. And then, nature itself seemed to side with him. That morning, a thick fog rose from the lake's surface, concealing the entire Carthaginian preparation, the moment of bloodshed. As the Roman column entered the narrow pass, everything seemed quiet. Flaminius, in his eagerness to catch Hannibal, didn't halt for reconnaissance. At that very moment, a war horn sounded from the mountainside, and all hell broke loose. From within the fog, Carthaginian forces swarmed down from three sides. The Roman soldiers, strung out in a long, disorganized marching column, had no time to form a battle line. The historian Polybius recounted that the surprise was so terrifying that it was not a battle, but a slaughter. Thousands of Roman soldiers were driven to the water's edge, where their heavy armor caused them to drown in desperation. Local legend later held that a nearby stream was stained so red with blood that it was named Sanguinetto, the river of blood. In the chaos, Flaminius himself fell. He was killed by Ducarius, a Gallic warrior whose family had been lost to the Romans, and who now found his chance for revenge. A total defeat. When the fog lifted, the tragedy was revealed. 15,000 Roman soldiers were dead, and most of the rest were captured. It was one of the most catastrophic defeats Rome had ever suffered. Rome was shaken. Crowds panicked, some believing Hannibal would march straight for the city gates. Rome's military spirit, which prided itself on never yielding, was dealt a severe blow. The rise of a new strategy. Faced with disaster, Rome was forced to change. They appointed a new figure with near-absolute power, Quintus Fabius Maximus, who would later be called Cunctator, the delayer. Fabius proposed a completely opposite strategy. No direct confrontation, avoid decisive battles, cut off Hannibal's supply lines, and scorch the earth so the Carthaginian army could not find food. This became the Fabian strategy, a new way of thinking that many Romans initially saw as cowardly, but which would later become a crucial factor in saving the Republic. The defeat at Trasimene taught Rome a painful lesson. Aggression and arrogance could not defeat strategic genius. To survive, Rome had to learn patience. Historical significance. The Battle of Trasimene not only cemented Hannibal's reputation as a master of ambush, but also marked a shift in Roman strategic thinking. Militarily, it was the largest ambush in ancient history in terms of the number of soldiers annihilated in a single stroke. Politically, it forced Rome to adopt a long-term strategy instead of seeking a quick victory. Psychologically, it instilled in the Romans a fear known as Hannibal ante portas. Hannibal is at the gates. And as if that wasn't enough, Hannibal was preparing an even greater masterpiece, a perfect trap that would make Roman blood flow like rivers. Just 1 year later, on the fields of Cannae, he would create a double envelopment so perfect that it is still taught in military academies thousands of years later. But to understand Cannae, we must first see what made Rome unable to stop itself from walking into the trap. Pride, impatience, and a thirst for revenge. Part 5. The Perfect Trap, Cannae. There are battles that become legends not just because of the blood that was shed, but because they nakedly expose the genius of man, both his arrogance and his brilliance. The Battle of Cannae in 216 BC was one of them. It was not just a victory, but a tactical masterpiece, referenced by military academies worldwide to this day. Rome wants revenge. After Trasimene, Rome fell into a panic. But the Roman spirit had a peculiar trait. The more they were pushed, the more resolute they became. The people no longer wanted to evade conflict as they had under Fabius the Delayer. They wanted a resounding victory, a decisive battle to restore their honor. In 216 BC, the Senate decided to raise the largest army in Roman history up to that point, approximately 86,000 soldiers. 2 new consuls were elected, Gaius Terentius Varro, reckless and impatient, and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, cautious and reserved. 2 men of opposite temperaments who had to take command on alternating days. With overwhelming numbers, Rome believed it would crush Hannibal once and for all. Cannae, where the dusty wind blew fate. The chosen location was Cannae, a dry plain in Apulia, southern Italy. This was the site of a Roman supply depot, which Hannibal deliberately seized to force Rome's hand. Cannae had no fog like Trasimene, no shielding mountains. It was open ground, seemingly advantageous for Rome's superior numbers. But it was here, on what seemed like favorable terrain, that Hannibal would turn it into a graveyard for tens of thousands of Roman soldiers. The Crescent Formation. Imagine the morning of August 2nd, 216 BC. A hot wind from the Adriatic Sea blew dust into the faces of the Roman soldiers. Rome, 86,000 soldiers, arranged in a deep, dense formation, determined to overwhelm the enemy. Hannibal, approximately 50,000 troops, outnumbered nearly 2 to 1. But in his hands, he held a grand idea. Hannibal arranged his formation in a crescent shape, bulging forward. In the center were the less experienced Gaulish and Iberian infantry. On the flanks were his elite African troops. Farther out, his Numidian and Iberian cavalry were commanded by Hasdrubal and Mahabal. When the attack began, the Roman infantry concentrated its force on the center, pushing back the Gauls and Iberians. The Romans believed they were winning, that their massive formation was crushing the enemy. But in reality, they were being drawn deeper into a trap. The pincers close. As the Roman mass surged forward, Hannibal's crescent slowly bent inward, becoming a concave arc. Immediately, the African infantry on both flanks charged into the Roman sides. Meanwhile, the Carthaginian cavalry had routed the Roman cavalry and circled around to attack from the rear. The entire Roman army was now surrounded on all four sides. Polybius described the scene with cold words. The Romans were trapped in an iron ring with no escape. Livy added a more tragic colour. They were slaughtered not like warriors but like animals herded into a pen. A day when blood darkened the plain. In the tight encirclement, Roman soldiers were packed so closely they couldn't even swing their swords. Soldiers fell, and their comrades behind trampled over them. Ancient records claim that in just a few hours, between 50,000 and 70,000 Roman soldiers were killed, while Carthage lost only about 6,000 men. It was a disaster unprecedented in Roman history. The consuls. Paulus was killed in action. Varro managed to escape. Hannibal had thousands of signet rings collected from the Roman nobility and sent them back to Carthage as gruesome proof of the scale of his victory. The aftermath. Rome on the brink of collapse. The news from Cannae struck Rome like a thunderbolt. Many Italian allies immediately abandoned Rome to join Hannibal, most notably Capua and later Tarentum. The Romans were plunged into mourning. Noble families lost both sons and fathers. One historian estimated that 1 in every 3 adult men in Rome fell at Cannae. Militarily, Rome had lost a huge portion of its elite forces in a single day. Psychologically, the shock seemed enough to bring down the entire republic. The Hannibal paradox. But it is here that the greatest paradox of history emerges. The victory at Cannae was the pinnacle of tactical art, but it was the turning point that led to Hannibal's strategic failure. Instead of forcing Rome to surrender, Cannae made them more determined. Rome abandoned the illusion of a quick victory and returned to the Fabian strategy, avoiding direct engagement, prolonging the war, and wearing Carthage down. Polybius remarked, "Hannibal could win every battle, but he could not win the war." Napoleon later admitted, "All admire Hannibal at Cannae, but no one could repeat it because no one would dare pay the strategic price he did." Historical significance. The Battle of Cannae became the textbook example of a double envelopment studied for over 2 millennia. From Germany's Schlieffen Plan in World War I to military academies like West Point, Hannibal's tactics are still taught as the ultimate example of military art. But for Rome, Cannae was not just a lesson in tactics, it was a wake-up call. An enemy could kill 100,000 men in a day, but he could not kill the will of an entire people. And it was that will that would gradually turn the tide. After Cannae, Rome did not collapse. On the contrary, they became tougher, more cunning. Meanwhile, Hannibal, though victorious on the battlefield, saw his resources dwindle. Cannae, therefore, was both a glorious peak and the beginning of Hannibal's tragedy. In the next part, we will see this clearly. A long war of attrition, where a lone genius faced the institutional endurance of Rome. That will be the story in our next chapter, The War of Wills from Italy to Zama. Part 6. The War of Wills, from Italy to Zama and the Legacy. If Cannae was Hannibal's brilliant peak, the years that followed were a long, arduous journey, where he had to fight not only the Roman army, but also the resilience of a republic. It was a phase that transformed the war from a series of spectacular battles into a contest of wills, ultimately shaping the future of the entire Mediterranean. Rome, rising from the ashes. After the disaster at Cannae, Rome seemed on the verge of collapse. Many allies in southern Italy and even Sicily turned against them. But instead of negotiating peace, Rome made a decision that astonished the world. No negotiations, no surrender. the Senate issued a call. No Roman citizen shall speak the word peace until Hannibal is defeated. They recruited more soldiers from every class: farmers, slaves, even prisoners. The Republican spirit of discipline transformed into a total war machine, and Rome found in its defeat a new strategy: avoid Hannibal, but attack Carthage elsewhere. The Fabian strategy returns. Quintus Fabius Maximus, the delayer, once mocked for not daring to fight, was now proven right. Roman generals adopted the Fabian policy: avoid decisive battles with Hannibal. Employ a scorched earth policy, burning fields to deprive the Carthaginian army of food. Harass foraging parties. Hannibal, despite being on Italian soil, gradually lost the ability to win more decisive victories. He lacked logistics, lacked reinforcements from Carthage, and after many years, his multi-ethnic army began to tire. Scipio Africanus, the general of a new generation. While Hannibal was wearing down in Italy, a new Roman star rose. Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Africanus. He was the son of the general Scipio, who had lost to Hannibal at Trebia and had witnessed his father's defeat firsthand. The young Scipio learned from his enemy. He studied how Hannibal used surprise, discipline, and psychology to turn the tide. And then he applied everything he learned on another front: Iberia. In 209 BC, Scipio captured Carthago Nova, modern-day Cartagena, Carthage's logistical center and treasury in Spain. In 206 BC, at the Battle of Ilipa, he defeated the Carthaginian army using the very arts of deception and maneuver, almost a reverse Cannae executed by the Romans. Iberia fell to Rome. Carthage's supply of silver and mercenaries was cut off. The recall and the Battle of Zama. When Scipio brought the war to North Africa, Carthage had no choice but to recall Hannibal to defend his homeland. After more than 15 years on Italian soil, Hannibal left the place that had made his name to return to Carthage. In 202 BC, the two military geniuses, Hannibal and Scipio, faced off at Zama, not far from Carthage. Hannibal deployed his iconic weapon, war elephants. But Scipio was well prepared, creating open lanes in his formation to neutralize the elephants. Then, the Roman cavalry, along with their Numidian allies, routed the Carthaginian cavalry and enveloped Hannibal's army from the rear. Zama was Hannibal's first and only defeat in a major battle. He retreated in good order, but Carthage was forced to sue for peace. The result? It lost its entire fleet, its colonies, and had to live as a client state of Rome. The exile years of Hannibal. After the war, Hannibal still tried to serve Carthage. He initiated financial reforms, fought corruption, and paid off the war indemnity faster than Rome expected. But this very success made Rome nervous. Hunted, Hannibal went into exile at various eastern courts, from King Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire to Bithynia. Everywhere he went, he tried to continue the fight against Rome, but always failed. Finally, to avoid being handed over to the Romans, Hannibal committed suicide by poison in 183 BC. Livy recounts that before he died, Hannibal said, "Let us relieve the Romans of their long-standing anxiety, since they find it too tedious to wait for the death of an old man." An immortal legacy. Hannibal failed to destroy Rome, but his legacy is eternal. Tactically, Trasimene is the perfect example of an ambush. Cannae is the pinnacle of double envelopment. The crossing of the Alps is a feat of logistics and psychology. As a man, he is the model of a general who lived with his soldiers, shared their hardships, and earned their absolute loyalty. In influence, Napoleon, Wellington, and even generals in the world wars studied Hannibal. Polybius praised him as a natural-born genius. Livy, though a Roman, had to admit that no one in history could compare. The paradox of history. Ironically, Hannibal's failure was the very thing that forged Rome into a superpower. Rome learned to abandon its impatience and shift to long-term warfare. Rome turned tragedy into a catalyst for military reform. And most importantly, Rome understood that to rule, they had to build a durable institutional system, not just rely on individuals. Hannibal did not destroy Rome. He made it a more powerful empire than ever before. A conclusion: a war of wills. When we look back at the entire story, from the oath of a 9-year-old boy at an altar in Carthage to the exiled death of an old general, we see a profound message. History is not decided by battlefield victories alone, but by the endurance of collective will. Hannibal won all the major battles, but Rome won the war. And that is why the confrontation between Hannibal and Rome is not just a chapter in military history. It is an epic of humanity, where an individual genius collided with the enduring strength of an entire people. As we close this journey, we remember not only the bloodshed at Trebia, the fog of Trasimene, or the encirclement at Cannae. We also remember the lesson of Zama, that one person, no matter how great, cannot overcome the strength of a community that knows how to unite, learn from failure, and resiliently refuse to fall. A whisper from history. Ladies and gentlemen, the story of Hannibal has come to a close, from the boy who swore hatred for Rome, to the general who crossed the Alps with war elephants, and then fell in the tragedy of exile. He left humanity a timeless lesson. Innate talent can shake the world, but only the collective will and endurance of a people can determine the destiny of history. More than 2,000 years have passed, but the shadow of Hannibal remains, in epic histories, in military strategies, and in the memory of a man who dared to challenge an entire empire. And as we look back, we also ask ourselves, in this life, are we Hannibal, the one who dares to dream and confront fate? Or are we Rome, the power of persistence that never accepts defeat? That answer, perhaps, is the greatest legacy that Hannibal has left for each of us. Thank you for joining me on this journey back in time. If you love history and want to continue exploring the stories that made the world we live in, please subscribe to the channel, share the video, and join me in opening other mysterious doors to human history. Because history, in the end, is not just the past. It is the mirror that illuminates the present and guides the future.